Hi, everybody. I am really excited that you're joining me today for a short overview on the Great Goliath Grouper Count. So first, I'm just going to start out with just a little background on the biology of this fish, sort of a review. Goliath grouper are one of 16 different managed species of grouper in the state of Florida. However, Goliath grouper are the only ones that enjoy full protection. So obviously, if you catch one, you have to return it to the water, regardless of season, location, or size. Goliath grouper are pretty unmistakable, basically because they do get so large. But when in doubt, the best thing to look at is the caudal fin. Goliath grouper do have a rounded tail fin. Some of the other larger groupers are going to have that straight edge on the edge of their tail fin. So take a peek at that caudal fin. If it has that rounded edge and it's a larger fish, it's very likely going to be the Goliath grouper. They've also got kind of a unmistakable body pattern, kind of with these olive and brown mottled markings and big old head. So historically, these are one of those species that has been really intimately connected to both our inshore and our offshore habitats. They do utilize estuarine, brackish waters, specifically mangroves, as a juvenile nursery habitat. They stay within these estuaries and nursery systems until they're between about 4 to 6 years of age, which is also correspondent with the size at which they reach sexual maturity. The adults will form large spawning aggregations in deeper waters, typically associated with some sort of high relief reef. And in depths anywhere from like 120 to 160 feet is where the spawning observations have been observed historically. These adults will form these spawning aggregations in the late summer to early fall. And they have basically a planktonic larval phase. The baby groupers will float around in the plankton for between 30 and 45 days and then end up settling within our inshore estuarine habitats, where they again will stay between 4 and 6 years until they start gradually moving offshore as they get larger. Goliath grouper historically have been found throughout the Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean Sea, along the coast of Central America, as well as along the northern coast of South America and the coast of Brazil down here. They have always been very abundant on the southwest coast of Florida. When fisheries did exist, the majority of animals were landed here on the southwest coast of Florida. And that's probably due to the extensive nursery habitat that we have along the West Coast. If anybody's ever visited the 10,000 Islands, Charlotte Harbor Estuary, Tampa Bay Estuary, you're aware that the mangrove systems within these nearshore places are quite extensive. And this has been excellent nursery habitat for Goliath grouper. They do have a biology and life history that do make them relatively susceptible to overharvest. Some of those characteristics include the fact that they live a long time. They can reach very large sizes, maxing out at a lengths that can exceed 7 feet. We know that they can live at least into their late 30s and probably well into their 40s and 50s. And as I mentioned previously, they don't mature until they're relatively late and relatively large. So they have to be about 3 feet in total length before they're even capable of reproducing. And that corresponds with an age of somewhere between 4 and 6 years. We know that groupers are capable of changing sex, and this is a life history characteristic that can complicate management. They are sedentary. They stay put for very long periods of time at spots that they have relatively strong site fidelity. So they do form predictable aggregations both during the spawning season and outside of the spawning season at high relief habitats relatively close to shore. So even the deeper spawning aggregation sites are still in only like 150 to 200 feet of water. So all of these life history characteristics make them relatively accessible to humans. And they are vulnerable to overfishing based on these characteristics. And historically, they were overfished. Fisheries for Goliath grouper have existed for centuries, both for sport and for food. But in the early days, really large numbers of the adults were not harvested. A few trophy fish here and there, but the real peak in the Goliath grouper fishery didn't occur until the 70s and 80s. And that corresponded with the increase in the price of meat, as well as a time where we were having a lot of technological advancement in getting into these offshore habitats. So the tools we used offshore were getting better and increasing our ability to find locations. Loran was coming out and doing well, bottom finding machines were advancing, and diver capability was also increasing. So all of these things led to basically a point where too many Goliath grouper were taken, and they were overfished quite significantly through the 1980s. And in 1990, there was an emergency closure based on noted dramatic population declines. They've been protected from harvest in the US since that time. However, in 2006, the National Marine Fisheries Service did remove Goliath grouper from their species of concern list, but they remain listed internationally as critically endangered on the IUCN Red List. There are conflicting perceptions and varying levels of pressure on managers to reevaluate the current management plan for Goliath grouper. But the stock assessment for the species does remain difficult due to a lack of traditional fishery-dependent data, as well as just basic life history characteristics that still need a little bit further investigation. So the current status of the population in Florida is encouraging. They have definitely responded well to protective measures. We do have evidence that there is increasing juvenile abundance in nursery habitats. However, there's an asterisk next to that because this species is sensitive to red tide events and also cold weather events. So these are unpredictable, stochastic natural sources of mortality that do occur and do impact Goliath grouper at a relatively significant rate. And also it has been suggested that the diminished availability of mangrove habitats could serve as a bottleneck to the complete recovery of the species, because as I mentioned earlier in the talk, Goliath grouper very dependent upon healthy mangrove and extensive mangrove estuaries for juvenile nursery areas. So anyone who's looked at a satellite image of Florida knows that our mangrove habitat overall has decreased with coastal development. However, we definitely know that adult numbers are increasing. If you talk to any angler or diver on the west coast of Florida, it is quite obvious that there are more Goliath grouper at sites than there used to be. However, again, the stock assessments continue to fail due to a lack of traditional data, and also directed research efforts have been, kind of relied upon for getting a better estimate at population recovery numbers. So one of the responses to this need for more data was the Great Goliath Grouper Count. This is a citizen science effort that was initiated in 2010, and it was a joint effort between Florida Sea Grant, the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and the Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, and volunteer divers who basically wanted to participate in the data collection process. So the goal of the Great Goliath Grouper Count is to provide a broad geographic snapshot in a relatively short time frame of Goliath grouper abundance and size distribution at reefs off of Florida. This allows us to utilize a citizen scientist group and allow us to provide these data to the management agencies. The data are compiled and submitted to FWC, and they have been utilized in previous stock assessments for Goliath grouper as part of the puzzle that goes into the stock assessment process. So I kind of like to equate the Great Goliath Grouper Count to other widespread animal abundance estimates that occur annually. So this image here is a picture of from an airplane of a manatee aggregation site at one of the warm water outflows. This happens, manatees, as everyone knows, aggregate near warm water when the temperatures drop. So that makes it a really easy time for manatee biologists to go out and sort of get an idea of manatee numbers, because there are predictable spaces that they can go and count the manatees during the winter. So obviously with something like a grouper, it isn't easy to see all of them from the air at certain times of the year, but the Great Goliath Grouper Count does allow us to focus on specific habitats during a very short time frame, the first 2 weeks in June, and to kind of get an idea of how many Goliath grouper that people are seeing out there during that 2-week period every June. We do know that Goliath grouper do aggregate at artificial reefs, and we do know that Goliath groupers spend days to weeks to months at the same sites. So the chances of them swimming in between wrecks within that short 2-week time frame is relatively small on the whole scale of most of these individuals from what we know about their movement behavior. So the Great Goliath Grouper Count does prioritize artificial reefs as a survey site. So our citizen scientists are encouraged to choose for their surveys artificial reefs as the places that they go to look for Goliath grouper during these 2 weeks every year. These are just some data to demonstrate that we know that Goliath grouper do aggregate. This is a really simple scatter plot, but it shows the number of fish observed and the month that they were observed at a whole bunch of different artificial reefs as this is part of another survey project. But the point of this image here is to show that, you'll see anywhere from 1 or 2 to maybe 25 individuals at an artificial reef, depending on the size of that site, the depth of that site. But then when you look at natural artificial reefs, especially on the West Florida shelf, really the number of Goliath grouper that you see on these natural bottoms is smaller. And this is probably related to the fact that Goliath grouper really like high relief habitats. So areas, because again, they're ambush predators, they like to be undercover. So they want to be at a site that has some relief, has some structure. So they're very structure oriented. So artificial reefs are a good place to prioritize during the Great Goliath Grouper Count. To kind of give you a snapshot of how this has evolved through the years, the Great Goliath Grouper Count began in 2010, and it started out as just a regional effort on the west coast of Florida. So from Tampa Bay moving south, this is kind of where we were focused when in early days of the Great Goliath Grouper Count. However, over the past 10 years, this initiative has really evolved into a greater regional effort that has expanded to include the Florida Keys and the east coast of Florida, as well as some sites up here in the Panhandle. So we do encourage citizens that are interested in participating from all areas within the Goliath Grouper range to contribute data to this effort. It is valuable and it is definitely informative to the process. The other thing we'd like to prioritize during the Great Goliath Grouper Count survey identification sites is repeatability. So, places that can be visited every year through time are much more valuable to the data collection process because that site through time, you can assess actual changes in potential size distribution or abundance of fish that you see at that site. So if you have a favorite artificial reef, we encourage you to choose that one and maybe choose a couple more within proximity of that can make your Great Goliath Grouper Count survey day relatively efficient on the water. And then also you can go back to that site the next year and the next year and the next year. And those data compiled actually contribute really valuable information to managers. I just kind of want to show some data real quick to show you sort of like what we're seeing through the years with the number of Goliath grouper that are being observed per survey. And this is Southwest Florida. You've got year along the x-axis and the number of Goliath along the y. And again, the green boxes are Southwest Florida. The yellow boxes indicate what's going on our Atlantic side. We have way fewer surveys on the Atlantic side, but you're also seeing fewer numbers of Goliath grouper during those surveys. And then this is the Panhandle data that we've received through time. The greatest number of effort historically has been in Southwest Florida. This is also where we see the greatest number of fish, but we are seeing as we get more and more data from these other regions, it's possible to assess trends in maybe potential increasing abundance along the Atlantic side of Florida and also up into the Panhandle region. This demonstrates the number of surveys by region through time. And so again, you can see in 2010, there's only a green bar because we only were looking at Southwest Florida in 2010. But as time has gone on, other regions have started participating and we've started getting data from other parts of the state. So that is just one more way for me to say that wherever you are, if you're in the state of Florida or if you're within a part of the Goliath Grouper geographic range, please feel free to participate and contribute data to this process. The other thing that we look at when we're surveying is the size distribution of the fish that we see. So not just counting the Goliath grouper on these artificial reefs that we survey, but also estimating the size. And we keep this pretty simple based on, you know, minimizing error. So we have these general size bins of basically little Goliath grouper, less than 3 feet, kind of mid-range from 3 to 5 feet in total length, and then the bigger fish that are greater than 5 feet in total length. So the divers, as they swim the survey, when they see a Goliath grouper, they mark that fish down and then they circle which size bin they estimate that fish to fall into. And that can help us provide information to managers on the size distribution of the fishes that are present at some of these offshore and nearshore artificial reef sites. So every June, again, trained divers that have either gone through a local in-person training with their local Sea Grant agent or have spoken with me in depth in person or on the phone, or potentially have taken this short video course. Those divers will collect a standardized set of data through underwater visual surveys and provide that data back to Florida Sea Grant. We compile it, do quality control, and then submit that packet of information to the Fish and Wildlife Research Institute and Stock Assessment Group at FWC. This is the data sheet, and these haven't changed since 2010. They've changed very minimally, which allows for good comparison among years. I'm going to kind of walk you through some of the most important pieces of information that if you are recording data, you need to remember to write this down. We can print these out on waterproof paper for you, or if you have waterproof paper at your disposal, you're welcome to print them out on your own. But basically, you fill these out on the boat and submit them to us when you've completed your surveys. I want to point out that this is obviously a really critical piece of information is the lat long of the site that you are surveying. So the site name is useful, but some folks in different parts of the state have the same name for very different spots. For example, the shrimp barge. There are a lot of shrimp barges in Florida that people dive on and locally call that spot the shrimp barge, but it might be separated by 75 miles. So the lat long is important. And this again comes back to picking your site. If it's a site that you don't want to share with us, then obviously don't include it in your Goliath Grouper Count survey sites. If you are concerned about the exact location being shared, I completely understand that. But if you can get within 1.5 miles when you write your lat long down, leave off a couple decimal places when you're writing down your lat long, that's completely acceptable, as long as we have a name that we can come back to you and ask you about it if we have questions. But then again, you got to get us close on the lat long. So it's just kind of a reminder, don't forget to write down a lat long or close lat long when you are recording where you are surveying. And then go ahead after you've filled out the front part of that sheet, you know, we actually ask for some information on topside conditions. The reason we ask for this is basically because if you have a wind speed and direction of like 25 knots from the northwest, we know it's kind of a rough, yucky day on the boat for you. Cloud cover can give us some indication of underwater visibility. Sometimes when it's real dark, obviously you don't see as well underwater. Wave height, again, is just another way of us getting an idea of kind of the situation that you're diving in. The site type, please go ahead and circle whatever artificial reef field it falls into, or if you have a natural spot that you just want to survey because you know that it's a great site, then go ahead and, you know, give us that extra information and sort of a description. For survey type, almost all of you will be doing roving diver, which is basically where you just kind of go down and swim from one end of the site to the other at your own pace. But there are a few groups that still do transects with a measuring tape. And if you're in one of those groups, obviously you would circle transect, but most of you, again, will be doing roving diver. The total bottom time you'll fill back out when you come back up and you get back on the boat. And then the maximum number of Goliath observed during a single replicate you can put here. And we'll go back, we'll get into that a little bit more. There's also a space at the bottom on the front page of your survey sheet for you to write any additional comments that you think are important. So perhaps there's another dive boat on the site. That would be informative because that could influence the behavior of the fish that are on the site. They could have scattered out if there was, you know, something else going on. If you see a lot of lionfish, if you see something, you know, a whale shark, you know, write down any sort of additional comments you think that will help you remember that dive if we have questions specifically about it and want to come back to you, or if you think there's just something really interesting, like tons of bait fish or, you know, any sort of random stuff you want to write down there. We are equally happy to see that. And then you kind of hit the water. And this picture shows like a typical diving conditions sometimes on the west coast of Florida. And I show this image because I think it is important to say that one of the tools you probably want to have with you is a flashlight of some sort, because Goliath grouper do enjoy being in structure, in the hidey holes, in the dark. Sometimes it is nice to have a light to help you look into some of those spaces and see if there are Goliath grouper in there. Those lights can help. We do want to know the visibility of the sites that you're diving. There's a space for that I'm going to show you on the back side of the data sheet, because we typically won't use data that come from visibilities less than 15 feet, horizontal viz, just because obviously if you can't see, it's going to influence your ability to count the fish that are there. Goliath grouper are large and they're noisy when they boom at you, but we still want to have some sort of a criteria, minimum visibility threshold. That being said, if the viz is really bad and you still want to do the dive, you still send us that survey sheet and we will use it accordingly, but just make sure that you indicate that your estimation of the underwater viz on that data sheet so that we can evaluate it appropriately. So this is just like a super simple schematic of what your dive might look like. You jump in the water and you go down and you're kind of my recommendation is to try to start your survey at one end of the wreck and try to do, or the reef, and try to do the entirety of the spot in one direction as best as you can. So you go down, you hit the bottom. You have your data sheet on your waterproof paper. I recommend taking it on a little clipboard that is with a rubber band around it. That's a really nice way to have it underwater. Bring a couple pencils in case you drop one, because they do float. Most pencils will float right up to the top. So you want to have another one in your pocket just in case that happens. And then check your dive computer or your watch and start your survey. Swim at a slow and steady pace from one end of the wreck to the other. And when you get to the end of the site, or when you need to turn around, that'll be the end of replicate 1. Okay, you're going to look at your watch again. You're going to write the end time of that first replicate. So all that was you just starting at one end of the wreck, swimming along, looking around, looking for your Goliath grouper until you get to the end. That was your first replicate. Okay, then you're going to look at your watch and you're going to start replicate 2, and you're going to just swim back the other way, same way you did, and you're going to count the fish that you see on your way back, okay, as a brand new replicate. Sometimes you don't see any fish on the way back. Sometimes you see twice as many fish on the way back as you saw on the first way. So just count that second replicate as replicate 2, and we'll talk through that on the next page. The other thing that's important to record is the vertical relief of the wreck. Okay, there's a spot for that on your data sheet. but basically it's the distance from the bottom to the highest point of that wreck or reef. And that is your vertical relief or your max height that you will be writing down on the same data sheet. And I'll show you that in just a sec. When you see fish, you're going to be estimating size. So as I mentioned before, these size bins are pretty self-explanatory, and they are also pretty simple. So less than 3 feet. I'm 5 feet tall, so I always think about it this way. If it looks like it's way littler than me, I know it's going to be less than 3 feet, right? 3 feet is a meter. Think of a meter stick or a yardstick. If it's smaller than that, total length, that's a small little fish. Those are more rare, especially at these deeper water sites, to see those little guys. But man, that information is valuable. If you are seeing little ones, definitely, get a good idea. If that for sure is less than 3 feet, circle less than 3 feet. Then there's that 3 to 5 foot range. So I'm normally like, okay, is it about the same size as me? That's in 3 to 5 feet. And then the big ones are the ones that are bigger than you. So kind of get a good idea that way. So you are going to want to kind of keep an eye out and kind of think about them size-wise as you look at them. So this is the back of that data sheet. So this is what you're going to have with you underwater. As I mentioned with the replicates, this is where you put your start time and your end time, right? You do want to, again, have some information about the habitat that you're diving. There's just a little more space for you to give us more details here. Most of the time, again, you're not going to be doing a transect. Most of you will be doing roving diver. I'd like to know if the shipwreck is nice and solid, or if it's all broken up and flat. That's just kind of, and then whether you think it's a big one or a little one. This is obviously qualitative, but it does allow you to provide a little bit more information on the size of the wreck that you're on. Some people like to dive the artificial reefs that are kind of concrete rubble or boulder piles. So then you kind of, is it all scattered out over many football field type space, or is it just a big pile of rocks that you can swim around and around? This kind of gives you a way to tell us a little bit more that way. The max depth is basically the bottom depth of the site that you're at. The reef height, again, as I mentioned before, is that maximum vertical relief from the bottom to the top of the reef. And you can write that down in feet is fine. Visibility is just your estimate of how far horizontally you can see in front of you. And then down here is where we get into sort of the meat of the Great Goliath Grouper Count. So as you're swimming along, say the first fish you see is in that like medium size range. That's Goliath Grouper number 1. So write that 1 down and then circle 3 to 5 feet. The next one that you see is number 2. He's big. Circle number 5, greater than 5 feet. You think it might be about 6 feet long? That's a way to, okay, then number 3, you're still on that same replicate. You're swimming, you're close to the end of the wreck now, and you see another like medium-sized fish. That's Goliath Grouper 3, and you circle that 3 to 5 foot range. Okay, now you're at the end of the wreck. You've swam from one end of the wreck to the other, and then you're turning around. Okay, so that is the end of the first replicate. You're going to stop. You're going to look at your watch. You're going to write the end time up here, and then you're going to turn around, but you're going to make some indication of that end of replicate on your sheet. So anything, you can draw a line, you can write end of rep 1, you can skip a couple spaces and start again, but make some indication after you're done with that first replicate. Even if it's the end of your dive, that's fine. Just write end or something that indicates that you're done. Okay, now you're heading back because you still have more time on the bottom. You want to survey again. You want to do a second replicate. You start swimming. The very first fish you see is a little one. That's fine. That's number 1, okay, because you're heading back. This is the beginning of replicate 2. And that's the only fish you see all the way back to the end of the wreck. That's okay. The other ones have gone out into the sand or wherever they are. You don't see them on the way back. You only see this little guy. You circle less than 3 feet, you write that down, and you got, now it's time for you to go back up and get back on the boat. Okay, so you can do this when you're underwater, or you can do it when you get back on the boat, but we do want to have some indication of how long it took you to swim from one end of the wreck to the other. So that's why this replicate 1 start time is here. When you got to the end of the wreck and turned around, that's that end time, and then you saw 3 fish. Remember, you saw 1, 2, and 3 on that first replicate. The second time, You turned around, you went back, you only saw one fish that time. You indicate that here. And again, your replicate 2 end time can go here. There's a space for replicate 3. You're happy to do one if you want, but no need. You don't even have to do 2 replicates. There's just room here for those people that want to survey spots multiple times when they're underwater. The other thing that you can do to help kind of keep track of the fish that you see is if they have any identifying characteristics. So sometimes these guys will have multiple pieces of lip jewelry, or be dragon leaders and weights, or have lures hanging off of them because of their interaction with anglers on those sites. So you're welcome to write down any of those sorts of observations that you see in the comment section next to that fish. So for example, this little guy had a hook in the lip on the left side of his mouth. So we wrote that down here. If we saw him on the way back, we would know that's very likely that's the same exact fish. It helps you kind of keep individuals separated too, because these fish do have a tendency sometimes to swim around and come back and show their faces again. And so to avoid double counting, it's always kind of good to have a analytical eye on them and keep an eye on who's who. So again, for measuring fish, I just kind of wanted to reiterate what that total length looks like. Most of you guys already know this, but we do want a general estimate of total length, and the total length is from the lower jaw, the tip of the lower jaw, or that that lower lip, estimate from there all the way to the end of the tail. Okay, so just like if you were catching a fish and putting it on a measure board to see if it was legal, you want to see how long he is, and total length is from that end of the head to the end of the tail. I just kind of put this in here for reference. This is a data sheet that's been fully filled out. You're welcome to pause it, take a screenshot, just to kind of give you guidance as you do your first sheet. This can maybe help you, but you're also welcome to reach out to me, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the data collection process. So it's not always as easy, and obviously, we don't expect you guys to have cameras equipped with lasers or anything like that. But see, here's a clipboard. You've got all the stuff that you need. There's a flashlight hanging here. This fish is being super cooperative, but it's not always going to be like that. A lot of times when you get underwater and you shine a light at them, they'll scoot off, and you'll basically just see a cloud of dust that was a Goliath grouper, but it's hard to estimate the size. Do the best that you can. That was definitely Goliath grouper 1. And you can, even if you're not sure, it's like between 3 and 5 or greater than 5, I don't know. You can circle both and put a question mark, and we can deal with that. But just try to get some sort of general indication of the size range that you think it is. Most of the time, we found these citizen science observations are very closely correlated to scientific diver observations. So don't doubt your abilities as a fish size estimator. A lot of times also you'll see Goliath grouper that are just enveloped in bait fish, and that can be sort of difficult sometimes to tease apart, but go ahead and do the best that you can. And then obviously we've always got distractions underwater. Try to limit your distractions, at least for the duration of your survey looking for Goliath, and then feel free to shoot fish and do whatever you normally do underwater after you've counted the Goliath grouper on the site and you're done with the survey. If you're interested in participating in this, I completely can encourage you to contact your local Sea Grant agent. FloridaSeaGrant.org is our web address. And if you go to the homepage, this is the About Us section. You can watch a really cute video about Sea Grant, but you can also click that directory button, which is right here, click directory. That'll take you here where you can click on an agent locator map, and that'll actually pop out the whole state of Florida, and you can click on wherever you live and you can find the Sea Grant agents that's associated with your region, and you can reach out to them directly. If that doesn't work out, you're also welcome to contact me anytime. My email address is right here, abcollins@ufl.edu. You can call me, you can email me, and we can talk more about this particular project. I'm really happy that you joined me today for this overview, and I'm really excited to kick off the 12th year of the Great Goliath Grouper Count. Please don't hesitate to reach out with questions, and if you need data sheets, I can easily stick them in the mail. Have a great day. Safe diving.